Welcome to the first lecture for Chapter 4 on interpersonal perception. In this chapter, we are really going to be talking about how we make sense of and perceive the world around us. When we go back to the model of communication competence, we're really focusing in this chapter on that bucket of interpretive competence. So really thinking about our ability to accurately perceive the world around us and make sense of and interpret what we observe. So when we are thinking about interpersonal perception, we know that to define perception broadly, we know that perception is the process of making meaning from the things we experience in our environment. So when we wake up in the morning, we are inundated with information and we have to sort through that information and make sense of it. When we're talking about interpersonal perception, this occurs when we apply the perception process to the interactions that we have with the people in our lives and the relationships that we are a part of. So really thinking about how in the interactions with those around us and with those that we are in relationships with, how do we make sense of what people are saying, what they're doing, really taking in. So we're really thinking about the decoding process here. If we go back to the model of communications, the decoding process involved receiving messages and making sense of them, and that's really what we're doing here in this chapter, and we are thinking about interpersonal perception. The chapter really went through the perception process. So what is the process or what happens when we are engaging in in perception, when we are making sense of the information that we receive through the different communication channels. And the book and the perception process is made up of 3 stages. And so we're really just going to go through these 3 stages. And as we go through them, we will think about, we are actually going in this lecture to complete your individual activity on social media perception. So go ahead as we go through this information, have that document ready, and you'll be able to fill that in, and at the end of the lecture there'll be some questions on the back, and then you can go ahead and submit that. So unlike some of your other activities, this activity is going to be completed while we are engaging in this lecture today, and you'll be submitting some of that information in Play Pause It. So the first stage of the selection process is of the perception process, is selection. And selection is essentially what happens when our mind and our body choose what stimuli we're going to attend to. So we know that in our everyday lives we are inundated with information through our multiples, through all 5 of our senses. We receive from the minute we wake up to the minute we go to sleep lots and lots and lots of information. And so it's impossible for our brain to attend to all of the stimuli that our senses encounter. And it's, it's required that we have to kind of sort through that information and figure out what information is important to attend to. And that information that we select is going to influence the rest of the perception process. Your chapter identified 3 characteristics that make some stimuli more likely to be noticed in our environment. The first characteristic is that it's either unexpected or unusual. So in this sense, stimuli that violate social norms in our environment are ones that are going to stick out to us, that's going to make us attend to that information, and we're more likely to remember that information. So one example that I give is for when we are doing something as simple as like riding an elevator. If we are going into the elevator, we kind of expect that people will be facing the doors. We don't usually talk to one another when we're in the elevator. We maintain kind of that safe distance. So if we go into an elevator, we see somebody kind of facing the back, so facing the wrong way. Maybe they're talking to themselves. Maybe they come up and they touch you, or they, are standing really close to you. That behavior is unusual. It's unexpected. It violates the social norms, and you're going to pay attention to it. You're going to notice that person. You're going to maybe your body physiologically may react. Your defense mechanisms may go up, and it's likely that when you get off the elevator and you go to wherever you're going, you'll be like, "Oh my God, you are not going to believe what just happened to me," and so that's going to stick with you. You're going to remember that because it was unusual, it was unexpected. The second characteristic that is important and that makes stimuli stand out over other stimuli is repetition, or how frequently it occurs. So when we think about maybe certain noises in the environment, if there was like a beep in the classroom and it happened once, you may not notice it. If it happened twice, maybe you wouldn't even notice it. But if it happened every like 3 seconds over and over and over again, that's something that you would probably pay attention to. You may be like, what's going on? What's that noise? And so repetition, or how frequently it occurs, is really important. It's going to make that stick out. And the third characteristic is intensity. So what is the kind of level at which a certain behavior, like when we think about it being unusual or unexpected, how unusual or unexpected is it? Like, how much of a violation is it of our social norms? We can think about intensity in terms of like loudness. So when I think about a stimuli that's really kind of intense, I think about like the fire alarms when they go off, either for a drill or for an actual fire. That noise is really, really loud, and it's supposed to be loud because you're, it's something that's supposed to catch your attention when you are engaged in other activities, when you're sleeping, and so the intensity of a fire alarm is to get your attention and to make you process that you need to get out, you need to leave the room, you need to be aware that there could be a potential fire. So what I want you to do now is I want you to get out your social media and the perception process activity. I want you to engage in the first kind of set of instructions. So, take out your cell phone. You can use your computer. If you have like a tablet or something, whatever you have available to you, to access one of your social media sites. So whether that's Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram or Twitter, and I want you to pick one profile. So it could be your friend, somebody like maybe if you're a friend on Facebook or Instagram, or it could be an influential figure that you maybe follow on Twitter. And I want you to kind of scroll through, look through their profile, and think about like what stands out to you. What you're getting a lot of information when you're on social media. So in that profile, what really catches your eye? And think about those characteristics that make stimuli stand out. Is there anything that's unusual or unexpected, that's repetitious, or that has a high level of intensity? And once you've had a chance to kind of go through and scroll and think about what you see, I want you to complete the first section in your activity, the selection section. And I want you to kind of analyze, using what we just talked about, the information that you see in that online social network profile. Okay, so we've talked about the selection process, and the next thing that is important to talk about, or the next stage in the perception process, is organization. So when we have attended to the stimuli in our environment, that's great, but we need to organize it in some sort of meaningful way. So thinking about how we make sense of, how we categorize, how we decipher what's similar to or different from other things in our environment. And when we think about the selection process, we know that there are 4 types of schema or categories that we use to classify information. So how do we classify what the stimuli that we see in our environment? Well, first we think about how it relates to physical constructs. So thinking about perhaps how a stimulus may emphasize a person's physical appearance. So if we think about interactions in our interpersonal relationships, what are the objective characteristics? So height, eye color, skin color, things of that nature, as well as some subjective characteristics when we think about physical attractiveness. Some of those things that we talked about in that nonverbal communication chapter. We evaluate information and we think about and interpret the interaction potentially based on some of these physical constructs. We also use role constructs, which emphasizes a person's social or professional position. So we use kind of information about a person's social roles to help understand and interpret that person's behavior and the messages that they're sending. So we may interpret the same message from our teacher or our father or police officer very differently, solely based on their role construct, based on their social or professional position. And so that's really important when we're organizing the information that we get in our environment. We also use interaction constructs, which emphasizes a person's behavior. So is their behavior kind of similar or different to what you've already encountered with them? Is it in line with their personality characteristics, like if they're outgoing or they're shy or they're aggressive? How does that play into what's going on right now? So thinking about the person's kind of normative behavior, thinking about the personality characteristics is really what we're thinking about and organizing when we think about interaction constructs. And the fourth is psychological constructs. So these really emphasize a person's thoughts and feelings. We may know that a person's going through a hard time. Maybe they're worried about something, or they're sad, they're grieving. We may know that they're angry about something or happy about something. And so all of this information really goes into how we classify and determine, essentially organize their behavior to help make sense of it. So all of these constructs are really important in the process of organization, which helps us determine how the stimuli are related to the interaction, to what we already know about that person, to the relationship, all of those things, which was really going to help us determine how that interaction is kind of similar or different from what we already know, which really leads into the last category that we'll talk about in just a moment. But first, I want you to continue on with your social media activity. So review the stimuli that you identified in the first part of the activity, and then complete the organization section. So think about these 4 constructs and really begin to organize the stimuli that you perceived that may be helpful to interpret what's going on in their profile. Okay, so the last stage of the perception process is interpretation, sorry. So interpretation is when we take the stimuli that we've selected, we have already organized this information using those role constructs, and now it's time to assess meaning, to figure out what that message, what that interaction, what that behavior, what it means to you. So really assigning meaning, figuring out, interpreting the interaction and what's going on. And when we are engaging in the interpretation process, we pay attention to 3 really important factors. So there are 3 things that in our interpersonal relationships that really help us interpret other people's behaviors. The first is our personal experience with that person. Do we have past experiences? Do we have, past interactions to rely on, to help understand, to help with that organization process? Do we have prior knowledge of that person? So thinking the second factor is thinking about prior knowledge. Do we have knowledge either through things like social media or through information that we get from mutual friends or perhaps from past experiences relating back to that first factor? And finally, our closeness with that person. So how close are we? story with them, and that may influence how we interpret that information. We know that sometimes we are more forgiving of, kind of violations of norms for people that are closer to us, that we have a relationship with. And so that level of closeness may really impact how we interpret. Even at the most basic level, if you're closer with somebody, you're going to have more knowledge about them and more experience with them. That's going to help you kind of organize the stimuli and make sense of what's going on. So we've really talked about this process in terms of the perception process, in terms of these kind of a linear way, breaking it up into these 3 stages. But we do know that it's not always, this crystal clear. The perception process can happen in an instant, and it's oftentimes subconscious. So, we can break it down like this, but the selection, organization, interpretation are oftentimes happening fairly simultaneously. But this is a nice way to kind of think about cognitively what's going on when we're making sense of the world around us. So the last thing related to your individual activity is I want you to complete the front by reviewing those first 2 sections and then completing the interpretation section. So really think about analyzing what's going on in that social network. Okay. So when we think about the last thing that we need to discuss in terms of the kind of introduction to the perception process is factors that may influence our accuracy. So we know that as humans, we aren't always that effective at accurately perceiving and assigning meaning to the world around us. We don't always make perfect explanations of other people's behaviors. And there are some influences, some factors that may influence our success in understanding and making sense of and assigning meaning, success in the perceptual processing. The first is our physiological states and traits. So thinking about physiological states as being temporary conditions that may influence how we perceive the world. So thinking back to some of that noise, those noise factors that we talked about in the first chapter. If we're hungry, if we're tired, if we're anxious about something that's temporary, those temporary conditions, those states may really influence kind of the assessment that we have, maybe even just the patience and time that we have the ability to make sense of the world around us. And then also our traits, so our ongoing stable conditions that may influence how we perceive the world. Kind of some of us may have certain like temperatures that are really important, that may influence how we perceive kind of an environment. We have different kind of personality traits that are important. So really thinking about these traits, these ongoing stable conditions that may influence how we perceive the world. As always, culture and co-culture is really important. So if we perceive the world in a more individualistic versus a collectivistic way, that's going to influence how we perceive the messages and how we perceive our environment, and how we interact in our relationships. Additionally, things like age, social class, so on and so forth are going to influence, so these co-cultures are going to influence how we perceive the world around us. And then finally, our social roles. So the sets of norms and expectations for a social situation guides how we make sense of and assign meaning. So things like gender roles, occupation roles, roles in the family, all of those things may help us or hinder us in our ability to make sense of what's going on in the world around us. So the last thing that I want you to do to finish up your individual activity is think about that second page, answering those discussion questions, and then when you are done, please upload that individual activity to Bolt, and then you can go on and engage in the second lecture for Chapter 4, thinking about attributions and attribution error.